You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Sons of the Shoe is back. Spencer German riding solo with you this week, but we are 1 week closer to sweet college football. It is so close, guys. It's right around the corner. 3 weeks out now. We'll be getting actual college football on our TV screens and what we like to always call week 0. Week 1 comes shortly after that, as Ohio State will open things up against our brethren down the road, University of Akron, and we'll be off and running on the 2024 college football season. I am excited to be back with you with a new episode with college football on the horizon. August is always a fun time of year because you know that it's coming, and you also get the start of what we got this week, fall camp for the Ohio State Buckeyes program, which began late this week and brought some interesting storylines to the table in terms of things that we're going to talk about today, but also just in terms of what you can expect from the Buckeyes this year and some things to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks as they sort through some things. We'll talk about all that throughout the next couple of weeks. Nick will be back next week. We actually are very excited because next week we have Alec Dietz, who covers Oregon for the USA Today, is going to join us. So we'll talk to him and get sort of this Oregon perspective on this conference, this budding rivalry between the two teams. But in the meantime, we have plenty to talk about this week. And I actually do want to start out of the gate with one of the big headlines that came out of day one of camp in terms of for Ohio State, and something specifically that Ryan Day had to say, because he was asked point blank to define what he thinks Ohio State's identity is going to be in 2024. And I thought that his answer, well, I'll read you kind of what he said here. And his answer was very, what's the right phrasing? His answer was very political, and that he didn't, it was the biggest non-answer ever is a good way to probably put it. And I get that that's kind of par for the course. Coaches will generally do that. They love to just give you a very eloquent non-answer to questions that you're asking. But I think it's a good place to start, because going into the season, I think there are a number of different ideas as to what the Ohio State identity needs to be and what people are expecting Ohio State's identity to be, or what they're expecting them to be good at this season as they embark on this journey to try to win a national championship. And they're very much in that conversation. So what he said in response to the question of what is the identity for Ohio State this year, he said, quote, "You challenge all those guys. What is your identity?" He said, "I know what I want our team identity to be. I told the team it's to be the hardest playing team in the country. When someone watches the Buckeyes this year, they should see that. What do you want yourself to be? What do you want your unit to be? What do you want the offense to be, the defense to be? Those are the challenges that we've had this summer to our staff and our players," end quote. Again, very non-political answer from Ryan Day, by just kind of leaning into the idea that he's been asking the guys, hey, what do you want our identity to be? You get to decide. This is a choose your own ending book, if you will, where you guys are the authors of your own story. And there's some truth to that, I understand. But I do think that they need to go into this season having a good sense of, and I'm sure they do, and Ryan Day just wasn't going to share it, but they need to go into the season having a good sense of like who they are, specifically on offense. Because defense, I do think Ohio State's defense, from an identity standpoint, is kind of, I don't want to say self-explanatory, because that's kind of just like a cop-out like Ryan Day gave us. But when you're dubbing yourselves like best in America and your secondary is as good as your secondary is, you got all these guys coming back, you kind of know what to expect with that group. Like, I think that the identity of the defense is like pure domination. Like, there should not be a lot of teams that they struggle with, and they should be giving you advantages in the games that you are playing tougher opponents, because your defense is supposed to be superior to most of the defenses in the sport this year. And you have just an assortment, a plethora, of talent from top to bottom across this roster, specifically guys who obviously are coming back and are senior laden. Like there's going to be a lot of leadership on that side of the ball. So I actually think like from an identity standpoint with the defense, I think it kind of centers around the idea that those guys, that group specifically, and there are a lot of returners on offense too, don't get it twisted. But but with how many guys came back on defense in particular, I think the defense is kind of the calling card of this team and the thing that you fall back on when things aren't going right. Like when you need to stop, when the offense is maybe struggling a little bit, that's the group you're looking at. Like, okay, they got to get the job done. So I do think their identity kind of starts with that group and the leadership and the ability to in a pinch rise to the occasion and face the adversity. That's what I'm looking at with that group, and I think that can kind of set the tone then for the rest of the team, where you have some other leaders on offense that obviously returned as well. Offensive line, the running back room has some upperclassmen. Will Howard being an upperclassman, you're expecting him to kind of be a leader, but he's kind of new to this whole thing. So yeah, there's some interesting elements there, but I think the defense kind of sets the tone. I think they're kind of the anchor of this team as a whole. Offensively, though, is where I think people are going to be most notably paying attention to figure or trying to pinpoint or put a finger on what they do well or what their identity is. And I think that makes a lot of sense because it's the thing that has maybe the most questions right now. Like I think many of us are going into this year feeling pretty confident in the defense, and it is going to come down to a couple different elements here or there on offense that will reserve judgment to decide if this team's a championship caliber team or not for real. And that's expected. I think they expect that. I think they understand that when you have some turnover at the quarterback position, most notably, that's going to happen. And I do want to talk at a later date with Nick just about like what area, maybe specifically on offense, you think is going to hold Ohio State back the most. But that's for a later conversation. In terms of what their identity needs to be on offense, I do think that it has to start with the running back room. And we always look back and say like, yeah, you got these great you got these great Ohio State teams over the course of history that were really good, that had really good running backs. And that's kind of Ohio State football. And in a lot of ways, like that's kind of an outdated philosophy. And you can't just, but at the same time, in the same vein, like how has Alabama oftentimes got the job done? It's often been with like a great running game and a quarterback that can do things when they need to do things and some great receivers on the outside doing it. And I think that's where it starts. Like I think the offensive identity starts with those two running backs who are two of the best in the country, and to have them as a tandem together is a scary proposition for other teams, specifically other teams in the Big Ten, to have to worry about and to have to think about. And so I do think that the run game is sort of where we start with this, but it can't just be that group. I think Ryan Day and where he has to be careful, and this goes back to why they've lost to Michigan 3 years in a row. And this is also like, this is maybe where we pivot the conversation to in a more like an overarching whole team identity standpoint, because there's the offensive identity, there's the defensive identity. I think the defense sets the tone for what this group is going to be. How tough they're going to be is a word that Ryan Day obviously likes to throw around, and he used the phrasing of like the hardest working team in the country. I think when he says something like that, I do think there's some meaning in terms of not just resting on your laurels. And I think that starts with the defense being the group that's even though they're as talented as they are, not just going out there thinking that they're going to just destroy everybody. Like it definitely starts with them in some capacity. So that's what I mean by that. But from an overarching standpoint, like I think Ryan Day does have to be careful not to get too in. And I know he's not calling the plays this year. I know he's passing it off to Chip Kelly, but I think he has to be careful not to get too in his own way or in his own head about being something specific on offense that maybe this team isn't. And that's not to say like in the past he hasn't always gotten that right, because I think there's times where he didn't. Like we always look back and say, why didn't he use CJ Stroud as a runner more? Like I think that he was so dead set on, well, I'm going to make CJ Stroud this pocket passer, and that's what we're going to do. That he maybe neglected that part of his game. And then we saw in the Georgia matchup in the playoff that was actually an effective tool for this team and for this offense. And it was mind-boggling that he didn't tap into it sooner. And it could have been something that helps you maybe beat a Michigan that year. You never know. So I like that. That's something I think you look back on. And I do think there's some element of like Ryan Day just kind of wanting to like be right about the guy he has at quarterback at the time, or be right about the offense that he has kind of put together and the talent that's on it. And I'm not saying that there's this unit is no slouch. Like Jeremiah Smith, another thing Ryan Day talked about on day one of camp was kind of tempering expectations for him. They're not naming him a starter or anything crazy like that at this time, but it's the writing's kind of on the wall that he will be. And so, like, yeah, you got to use those weapons. I'm not saying not to, but I think he has to be careful to not fall into this trap that he has in previous years where he's like, we're just going to finesse our way to wins all the time and go away from the run game and go away from this team that could be really, really good in that area because of the two guys that they have back there and an offensive line that still has questions. And again, we'll talk about that at a later date in terms of if that being maybe something that holds this team back. But they're a year older. There's some guys in there on that front line that you should be able to trust a little bit more this year. And you got to feel good about the fact that these guys running behind them are also going to make up for some mistakes here or there that they might make up front because they're that good. But I think that the identity does have to start with having this great run game that takes some pressure off of Will Howard, who is a good running quarterback in his own right, but so that it's not like all on him to make these big throws, because that's the other area right now that I have questions about. We talk about the offensive line. I think there are some questions with Will Howard. I have been, I've planted the flag earlier this offseason about him being a good fit and how I think it's going to work and how I think he's a good quarterback. And I certainly think he's an upgrade from Kyle McCord, but there are still some questions there about, like, does he have that big gamer ability? Is he going to, in crunch time of a big game, like against Oregon or something, is he going to deliver in those spots? Like there is some of that to think about with him. And I think you alleviate some of that by having a really good run game and tapping into those two weapons that are going to be in the backfield with him and utilizing them in an effective way. And maybe some of that too is getting Caleb Downs involved. I know during spring ball, there was some usage of him coming out of the backfield. And so that seems like a tool that they're going to use or have at their disposal as well. But I do think, yeah, like the identity on offense does start with those two guys. And then it kind of rolls out from there with Will Howard being able to be comfortable, make the throws downfield, utilize these weapons. But if you just turn this into well, hey, let's just air it out and gun it up and down the field and finesse our way to victories again, I think that's going to be, again, maybe the downfall of Ryan Day like it's been in previous years, where then you lose to a Michigan or you lose to some of these other teams, and and you're sitting there licking your wounds and maybe looking for a job at the end of the season. So I think he has to be careful not to fall into that trap. I also think too, though, as much as, like, if you lean into that run game, I think the idea that Ohio State would be tough again, because this is the thing we've tapped into, right, with the Michigan losses, has been, well, Michigan was the tougher team. They were built to win in the Big Ten, and they weren't this finesse team like Ohio State was. Ohio State was a Ferrari. They were like a Ford F-150 or whatever you wanted to say for Michigan, whatever you wanted to say they were. And Ohio State has to be able to win both ways. And so you can't fall into the trap, though. I think, like, I think Ryan Day sometimes has a tendency of getting in his head with this stuff, where he like overthinks it. And he's like, well, this year's going to be the year we do this, or this year's. And I think that was on display last year. You get the rant after the Notre Dame game about my team is tough and blah, 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 blah. I'd like to know where Lou Holtz is right now, as we all remember. And I found that moment very amusing and still do. And I use that meme all the time. But I also, like, I think that was him showing us that he gets in his head sometimes about, I need to prove that my team's tough. I need to prove that my team is this. I need to prove that my team is that. And so he can't fall into that trap of trying to prove everybody wrong and be like, well, I need to prove that my team's tougher, so I'm going to do this, that, and the third to accomplish these things and prove that we are better than Michigan this year. He just has to kind of let it take care of itself. And I think if they lean into that run game being the focal point, they lean into that run game being the identity on offense as sort of the starting point, because you have two really good backs who are upperclassmen that you feel like you can rely on and trust, the rest will kind of take care of itself. And I think you can kind of build things from there. And I do think Chip Kelly alleviates a little bit of that as well. He's always tended to have really good running teams. He made UCLA a really good running team his several years that he was there. So I think if that's your starting point, if that's your identity, and I do think Ohio State fans can wrap their minds around that and get on board with that, because, again, we love to reference the glory days of Ohio State where running was kind of the bread and butter of the offense and of the team. I think that's an easy sell to fans as well. But I do think it starts there and kind of then, balloons out to other areas on that side of the ball. And I think if it'll take care of the other things will take care of themselves if you let that be the starting point. The conversations about being tough enough, the conversations about not being able to beat Michigan, like that stuff will come if you prove that you can win that way. And I think that's the thing that's kind of hanging over Ryan Day at this point. And he has to avoid, again, falling into the trap of just like trying to go out and do things to prove people wrong and just, coach his team the right way and let them win games the way that they should be able to and that they know how, because they're super, super talented team. What do you think is the identity of Ohio State, or what do you think should be the identity of Ohio State this year? Because Ryan Day gave you a big nothing burger of an answer. He said he wants to prove that they're the hardest working team in the country. That's coach speak. That's not an answer in terms of what their identity needs to be. But I want to know from the fan perspective, what do you think it should be? What will it be in 2024, which is a couple of weeks away now from actually getting rolling? We got college football on the horizon. I do appreciate you guys jumping in. It's Sons of the Shoe. We are a relatively new podcast, coming up on a year since we started this thing in October. So I implore you to like, subscribe, follow, whatever you do with however you interact with your podcast in the Odyssey app, at Apple Podcasts, at 922thefan.com, and the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel. Did I mention Apple Podcasts? Well, I'm going to mention it again, and I hope you'll find us there. When we get back, guys, a potential punishment for that team up north coming a year after the fact. We'll talk about that and what it means and why, whether or not I'm on board with this coming down now or not, based off of the sign stealing scandal. And of course, later in the show, we'll get you 4 down territory. It's Spencer German with you on the latest episode of Sons of the Shoe. Keep it locked. Here's a quick word from our sponsors, and we'll talk to you on the other side. Welcome back into Sons of the Shoe. Spencer German with you. Again, 3 weeks out from the start of college football, 4 weeks out from Ohio State's season opener against the University of Akron. And it's a fun time of year. And I can't believe, guys, that as we get ready for another college football season, and we are months removed from Michigan's title run, as much as it pained us all, and even more months removed from the whole sign stealing scandal that played out last year with the Wolverines, that we have reached a point that this is a topic of conversation now going into next season. I thought this was over. I thought this was behind us. I guess I shouldn't have been that naive, but I thought this was behind us. I thought we weren't going to talk about it anymore. I hated, as is well documented on this very show, Nick and I hated that this became a badge of honor for Ohio State fans to be like, well, they cheated. So that title has an asterisk. The asterisk thing, not for me. I hated that it became this, and this was all very stupid and contrived anyway. So I hate that we're now getting ready for another football season, and we'll have to have this conversation again. But there are reports out there, most notably from Chris Ballas of the Wolverine.com, that the NCAA is prepared to issue a notice of allegations against Michigan as soon as, now this said, this was earlier in the week. And so I think these allegations, or I think the punishment was rumored to potentially be coming down as soon as this earlier in the week, but it never actually did. We don't have any official word on this yet. So again, this is where there's some conflicting reporting going on, which we'll get into here in a second. But according to the source that was cited by Ballas, he says the NCAA could seek to ban Michigan from the postseason for 1 or 2 years. Michigan is expected to fight back against any postseason ban, and it is unlikely the ban will go into effect this year, as Michigan's appeal is unlikely to be heard by the NCAA's infractions committee until 2025. So they would still be eligible this year, but the ban could come into effect down the line here, I guess. But where there's conflicting reports, and this is where you get into like, well, who's the sources on this different stuff and whatnot. But Rivals Josh Henske has said that, quote, quote, there's zero concern in UM's athletic department that any postseason or bowl ban will be handed down. The NCAA struggled to find a direct link between Stalions' operation and the Michigan football program. That's weird to me that they have trouble finding the link between the two. The link is that he worked for the Michigan football program and he was going to these games and stealing the signs. And then, like, what did we think he was doing? How can you not find the link? I don't understand that. But I digress because, again, I'm not trying to make this a let's rehash all this and figure out if Michigan's guilty or not and point the finger and say, boo-hoo, you guys cheated. Because, again, I've established the fact. I want to be clear. I've established the fact that this was all very stupid from the start. I do think sign stealing is going on in general. Now, you can't get caught. And that's on Michigan. That's on Connor Stalions. Maybe we'll find out more in this Untold documentary. I doubt it. It's probably going to be it's going to be another puff piece that Untold and Netflix does. But maybe we'll get some big revelation that we'll all enjoy about why this is, a good thing, or why it was an informative documentary for once in our lives. But I think those days are gone of informative documentaries that actually are worth our time. Regardless, again, I think the outrage over the Connor Stalions thing got a little too crazy. I understand where if they're breaking rules, they got caught. That's wrong. Not a good look. I do think on some level this is happening everywhere. But my biggest thing with this now is that, again, we're having to rehash it almost a year later. I guess not quite a year later, but going into a year later, we're sitting here rehashing it, still trying to determine if Michigan deserves a punishment or not. And my biggest thing is this. I was against Michigan being banned from the playoff last year either, because it was like, listen, they proved they're the best team. Let them go out and try their hand at it and see what happens. Live with the results. I think it was a very loser's mentality for Ohio State fans to just like try to pull on that string and say that the championship has an asterisk and all these different things just because of this whole scandal and this whole situation. I think that's a silly take to have. But I will say, like, if the result is going to be the NCAA handing down a bowl ban, then that just like this is why the NCAA is stupid, because they're basically admitting, if they do this, that they shouldn't have let Michigan be in the playoff from the start. And again, I'm not saying they shouldn't have been. I want to be very, very clear here. I'm in favor of them having been allowed in the playoff and let this thing play out. I thought that we were grasping at straws because we were upset that they beat us for a third straight year to just sit there and point the finger and say, well, they cheated and blah, 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 blah. I'm establishing that again right now. But if the result was going to always be that the NCAA was going to hand down a bowl ban, you're kind of telling on yourself there. Like, you're kind of telling everybody that, yeah, we probably shouldn't have let them be in the playoff if that's what the result is going to be, which is just another reason why the NCAA is stupid. Because if that's going to be the result, if the result is going to be, well, this was bad enough and this was rampant enough and this was criminal in the eyes of college sports enough that it results in a bowl ban, then isn't that kind of a signal that you're telling us that they maybe shouldn't have been in the playoff last year? Again, not saying that is my feeling on it, but if that's what the NCAA is going to do, then that's basically what you're telling us anyway. And this is why people don't like the NCAA. This is why people don't trust the NCAA. Like, if this investigation reveals that Michigan should have a bowl ban, they probably shouldn't have been able to play for the championship last year. And that was an argument people were making, was like, how are they allowed to play when this whole thing's going on? And then I was team, let it be what it is. And like, there's no putting, you can't put it back in the jar now. You know what I mean? Like, the cat's out of the bag. We watched that team go on a run to the championship without Connor Stalions being part of the program anymore. And you can't just erase that from your memory. It's the same thing when you take away championships. And so that's not what's being said here. But if they're going to ultimately just be like, yeah, bowl ban, that kind of tells us that there should have been a bowl ban from the start if that was going to be the end result anyway, which is, again, silly and it's stupid because the NCAA just can't get out of their own way yet again to just to retroactively be like, well, you did this thing that was so bad that now the punishment is this. But in the meantime, the team went on to win a championship in the process. is just absurd to me. If this is the level that that college, that the NCAA believes this reached, if they think it was so egregious that they can give you a bowl ban, then you shouldn't have let it play out that way in the first place, because now everybody saw it happen and everybody consensusly agrees Michigan is the champion, except for salty Ohio State fans. And I'm not trying to, shit on Ohio State fans. I'm one of you. I'm with you. I just thought we latched onto that a little bit too hard. We latched onto the idea that Michigan should be booted from the playoff and all these different things just because they'd beaten us 3 years in a row, and it became a silly exercise. But so I can't do that. But it just feels like the NCAA, it doesn't feel like it is the latest example of the NCAA making it up as they go. If there was some sort of level of concern that this team was going to that at the end result of this investigation would merit a bowl ban, then you probably shouldn't have let them play in the playoff last year. If that's what you're going to get to here, like it doesn't make sense to me, because now they're basically saying like this was egregious enough to not let you compete for championships, but we let you compete for a championship while it was going on. And there's not really anything of consequence except for you're punishing players down the line that had nothing to do with it at that point. Like most of that team left for the NFL. Like, so again, to be clear one more time, I've said from the rip that the entire scandal from the beginning was stupid. The reaction to it was oftentimes very stupid. And Ohio State fans, most notably, because we were the ones grasping at straws, trying to say they deserve to be booted and shouldn't be able to compete in the playoff and all these different things. There was a lot. There was a very vocal Ohio State chorus of people that were saying and arguing that. And I was pushing back against it. But now I'm going to be the one who looks stupid if the NCAA puts out a bowl ban anyway, because they're basically telling you that this crime, this college football world crime, reached the level of being able to say you shouldn't be able to compete for championships. So if that's the case, why did they get to do it last year? And this is, again, like I said, why it's also stupid, because it shouldn't have been this serious. It shouldn't really, in my mind, warrant a bowl ban or a postseason ban, unless they directly. I mean, I don't know. I understand why it's a bad look and why it's a bad thing. I just thought like the discourse on the subject got a little out of hand, and I can't use that as the reason why I'm taking a championship away from Michigan. And because I can't do that, and because I already saw it happen, I can't now like try to put the lid back on this and be like, well, we'll ban them down the line here from a bowl. Like, no, you missed your window, NCAA, to do something of consequence if this was what you wanted to do. You could have done it last year when it was all still playing out and said, well, they're not going to play. But they knew that would make them look illegitimate, even though they look illegitimate anyway, and people don't even trust them or believe them, or they think they're a sham of an organization already. And that would have just made it worse. But this is now the next iteration of making it worse, because you're basically saying like, well, we're going to punish them after the fact. This is what the NCAA does best, though, right? They're always reactive instead of proactive. They never actually do and enforce things until it's too late and until everything's already kind of played out, and it always falls back on their lap that they then have to make some big decision. And so this is what's happening, but it's just stupid anyway. And now where there's so I don't know. I think ultimately my final stance on this is I hate that it's now going to dominate the news cycle leading up to the season, and maybe during the season, if this gets doled out here in the coming weeks or during the season or whatever, and Michigan finds out, next year, 2025, they won't be allowed to compete for a national championship. Ooh, okay. I'm sure they're really worried about that as they're in full rebuild mode right now. But I just think like, as much as I wasn't even on board with them banning them last year, if this is going to be what the punishment is, you should have just banned them last year. It's stupid. It's stupid. It is truly laughable, and that's what the NCAA has become at this point. Do you think Michigan should be banned from playing in bowl games? or get a postseason ban as a result of the Connor Stalions situation? Or are you with me that it's too little too late from the NCAA if they were going to do this, and that the whole thing was stupid anyway, and we should just move on with our lives? And if they're going to issue some sort of punishment, maybe it's like a fine or you take a couple scholarships away or something like that. But it shouldn't be in the form of this because, and that's my point. Like, at this, the punishment at this point shouldn't be anything other than some of the things I just laid out: a fine, loss of scholarships, whatever. Because it just feels very like revisionist history to be like, well, now you're going to get banned from playoff contention. And I think them getting banned from playoff contention would have been stupid last year. I think it's just as stupid now. Do you agree with me that the Michigan scandal has gone too far and that a postseason ban is a little ridiculous of a punishment at this point from the NCAA? Or do you think that they still should serve or be served this form of punishment and not be allowed to compete in the postseason here in a year or two coming? And what are your thoughts on it? We'll get you're more than welcome to comment at the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel. You can hit me up on X as well at Spencito_. When we get back from another break, final segment of the show, and it's another rousing rendition of 4 down territory, including a question about the future of running back at Ohio State after Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, and the game that you're most looking forward to that isn't an Ohio State game this year. We'll talk about all those things and more in 4 down territory when we get back after a quick word from our sponsors. Final segment, Sons of the Shoe with Spencer German riding solo this week with no Nick Wilson. I do want to remind you guys, we got Alec Dietz of USA Today. He covers the Oregon Ducks for the USA Today. Coming on next week's show, we'll record with him, I think, like Thursday night, so the episode should drop Friday morning. So stay tuned for that because we know how important that matchup with Oregon is going to be this year on Ohio State's schedule. And we obviously know that that could be almost like a budding rivalry. So we're going to get the opposite perspective, go behind enemy lines, if you will, and get that perspective on what lies ahead for this first year of this new remade Big Ten and specifically Oregon. So looking forward to that conversation. But in the meantime, we have a conversation to finish up right here on this episode, and it is our segment that we've brought back more recently to lead us up to the season. We'll obviously do it during the season as well, but it's a segment we like to call 4 Down Territory, where we talk about 4 different topics from both Ohio State, but also around the college football world. And we start with topic number 1, which is the Big Ten commercial is back, and it is beautiful, folks. It spans the country now. You start in California, you start in Oregon, or Washington rather. You work your way down to Oregon, down the West Coast, down to LA. You got you get the Rose Bowl popping up on the little map. You get USC Stadium, the Coliseum, popping up on the map. You make your way to Nebraska, and then it picks up where it used to be with all the Big Ten teams of lore that we've known for the last several years, and finishes out once again on the East Coast with Rutgers and all those teams. And you get this beautiful, beautiful map where it shows you just the reach that is the Big Ten Conference now. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I wasn't sure if they were going to remake the commercial in a different way, use a different song. I actually am impartial to the version people have kind of made themselves, where they put the Game of Thrones theme behind it, because the Game of Thrones intro, for those of you who maybe haven't seen it, is like this map of Westeros, which is the nation that they live in the books, obviously, in the show. And it like goes from like house to house all the way through, and it pops up. So I like that version that people have kind of turned it into, the viral version that they've made. But yeah, it's back. It's beautiful, and it includes the West Coast. I'm glad they kept this thing alive. I'm glad they kept it going. And I can't wait to see it on my TV for the first time because I only saw it on Twitter so far. But that first time that commercial is iconic. Like when you're sitting, it might be a commercial break during an Ohio State game. You get up to use the bathroom. But if the first commercial that plays out of the break and you hear that music play, you stop in your tracks and you turn around and you look at the screen and you watch it play all the way out. You just have to. It is like a rite of passage. If you're a fan of a Big Ten team, you'll watch the Big Ten commercial that spans the map and pops up with the stadiums and little iconic elements of each school. It's the best. It's the best. And I'm glad they kept it. And I'm glad it's back for the expanded Big Ten. We'll leave that one there. We go to topic number 2, second down. Our second down topic is back in relation to college football 25, which I have proudly started playing. I am on the train now. I'm all in. I started actually as Ohio State's first opponent this year, the University of Akron. I know it's like sacrilege working at another school in Ohio, but guys, if you play the game, you know you got to start at a small school and work your way up. So it's kind of like choose your favorite MAC school or your favorite non-Power 5 school. And I used to work at Akron, so I have an affinity for that school. And so I was like, I'll start at Akron. And the goal is that I hopefully work my way up and get to Ohio State one day. So when I get there, you guys will be the first to know on this podcast. But that's not where I wanted to start actually with this topic, because there are a bunch of patching that's going to be done to the game because people are outraged by the unrealisticness of the college football playoff that plays out around their dynasty teams, where it's like NC State making the final and Coastal Carolina somehow sneaks their way in and makes the semifinal, and people can't believe that it's not this realistic thing. I want to know from you guys, though, do you like the fact that it's not realistic and you like that there's some finicky teams in it? Because I am of the camp of this majority of people that have been complaining to the point where now it's getting patched, where I want it to feel realistic. Even though I'm running a dynasty that might make the playoff, and that's not really realistic for Akron to actually make the playoff. Sorry, Akron, I'm just telling the truth. In real life, I want the rest of it to feel realistic. Like I want Georgia in there. I want Ohio State in there. I don't need Georgia losing to some random, Arkansas, some random night, or I don't need Georgia losing to like Old Dominion or something like that, or Dominion. Did I say Old Dominion? Like the country band. I think I said Old Dominion. No, it is Old Dominion. I was right. All right, never mind. I stand corrected by my own Google search. But yeah, I don't need Georgia losing to some fluky team and then not ending up in the playoff. I need Ohio State in there. I need Oregon in there. Like I want the big teams to be in there so that when I get there, there's a challenge and it's not some fluky thing. So I'm of that ilk. But are there people who are really that are you that upset if that happens? Because in retrospect, like maybe that's what you want out of your video games. Is you don't want the realistic what's going to play out in real life. You want to see some quirkiness where you have a MAC school actually make a run to the championship and then get curb stomped by whoever. What do you think? Let us know your thoughts at SpenceC2_ and in the comments on the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel. Third down. We move on to third down, and this is where I pivot back to specifically Ohio State, because we've talked a lot, even in this episode, about the frontline guys at the running back position, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins. We know how great they are. But what's one thing to keep an eye on, I think, throughout camp and what is said about this group beyond those two, and early in the season, like when you're playing in Akron and Ohio State's up big and they start putting their subs in, right? Like, who is performing behind those two guys? And there's two names that obviously are going to stand out. Now, I actually was really excited because TC Caffey, he had a really good spring game. And I remember it was in my notes when I was at the spring game this past April, that he was playing really, really well in the snaps that he got. But he tore his ACL recently, so he's out for the year. So that leaves James Peoples and Sam Williams-Dixon as kind of the two guys who are next in line behind Judkins and Henderson. And this is important because you no longer have Dallin Hayden, who we know transferred to Colorado. Chip Trainum also transferred to Kentucky this offseason. And those are two big blows, because I actually thought Dallin Hayden in particular was kind of that next man up in this group. But once they got Judkins, I think he kind of realized the writing was on the wall for him, where he just wasn't going to get the carries. He was going to get somewhere else. And I can't blame him for trying to pursue something else. But it's a very unproven group behind Judkins and Henderson. And because we know Henderson's injury history in recent years, it is a little bit concerning that you don't have some greater depth maybe at that position, and especially now that Caffey's going to be done for the year. So that's something to follow, because seeing how those two guys perform as underclassmen on this team, newer recruits on this team, is going to could come in handy down the stretch of the season if Henderson's dealing with an injury or whatever, because we know Ryan Day is likely going to use multiple backs in different formations and different concepts and different things that they're going to try to do. So it's just something to keep an eye on. And I do think it's notable because, it's a top-heavy group right now. And behind it, it's a big guessing game in terms of what's next at that position for Ohio State after the season, when we're assuming Henderson and Judkins both end up going on to the NFL. That'll do it for third down. And to get us out of here, our fourth down topic is, which non-Ohio State game are you most excited about in 2024? I'm going to cheat a little bit here and give you a top three. I'm sorry. I know it's cheating. I said one game. I'm giving you three. But I do think there's three that have me really intrigued. And I think it's because they have an impact, I think, on what the playoff could look like, this new hierarchy of teams in different conferences, expanded playoff. These games are going to matter a lot. And so if we're leaving Ohio State out of it, because we know Ohio State, Michigan, massive game. We know that. Ohio State, Oregon, massive game. We've talked about that ad nauseum. We don't even have to talk about Ohio State, Michigan being a big game. We just know. So there are a lot of Ohio State games that matter this year, or several, a handful. But if we're leaving them out of it, I think the three games that I am most intrigued by and will be glued to start to finish that aren't Ohio State. September 7th, Texas at Michigan. First off, it's the college football championship matchup that we didn't get, because if Texas would have beaten Washington, they would have obviously played Michigan, and we could have seen how that played out. Now, it's a different Michigan team, so I'm not leaning into that a ton as my reasoning why, but this is kind of this new look Big Ten with an old school, staple program that's been here for a long time in Michigan, and the new look SEC in Texas, and they square off early in the season. Early in the season, we don't always get a bunch of these matchups with kind of cross. Well, actually, we do sometimes, but you only get so many of the cross conference matchups like this. So that's one I think out of the gate early on that has me intrigued. And I also think it's going to establish how good is Michigan really in the aftermath of all the guys that they lost in their championship run last year. And that could set the tone for okay, if they win that game, yeah, they're not fucking around. Ohio State's going to have to be, on their P's and Q's to be ready for another tough matchup with Michigan. It's always a tough matchup, but if they kind of get back to prominence and are actually competing for a championship, scary proposition for Ohio State, obviously. So I think that's where I start. The other two games are both out of the SEC, and one of the teams we already mentioned, Texas and Georgia, October 19th. Another big test for Texas. New kids on the block in the SEC. How are they really going to compete in this conference against the team that, now that Nick Saban's out of the way, is considered the gold standard in that conference, and maybe even in college football with Kirby Smart and Georgia and Carson Beck and all that. So that's a massive one. I think we'll all be paying close attention to that game because, again, it's another one that has big implications on how the SEC is going to play out. Are both those teams going to make the playoffs, or is only one of those teams going to make the playoffs? If Texas were to lose to Michigan and then lose to Georgia, I'm not saying two lost teams can't recover with this new playoff format, but they're already at a disadvantage, and maybe they don't make the conference, the conference championship game. What does that mean for them? So there's some different things in play for that game as well. And I know a lot of people are probably guessing I'm going to go Georgia, Alabama. And I do think that game matters, of course, because, well, first of all, it's Georgia, Alabama. But secondly, because it's the Kalen DeBoer Alabama team against the consistent as ever Kirby Smart Georgia team. Where does he pick up in the aftermath of Nick Saban retiring? We're all going to be wanting to see that and watch that, and it's going to matter. And that game is on September 28th. But I'm actually going in a different direction here. It is still Georgia, but I'm going Georgia and Ole Miss in November. And the reason I like this, the way I did this, was because I got a game in September that matters, a game in October that matters, and a game in November that matters. And the reason I say that is because I've been saying it on this show already. It is put up or shut up time for Lane Kiffin, all right? Lane Kiffin has kind of coasted with Ole Miss being good and, threatening some upsets, maybe pulling one off every now and then, but he has yet to win the SEC. He has yet to be a real contender in that conference. And now that Nick Saban is out of the way, I want to see, is he legitimately going to take the baton and be this great coach and seize the moment here? Or is this going to just be more of the same where he's good, but not great? And there still is sort of this the ceiling that he has yet to eclipse. And he can't quite get over it yet. I am fascinated to see if he can seize that moment and become almost this consistent contender that actually threatens Georgia more regularly, or if it's just going to be more of the same for Lane Kiffin. So I have my eye on that game for sure. And so those I think are going to be my three that I give you as the answers of my three non-Ohio State matchups, even though I said just pick one. My three non-Ohio State matchups that I'm most intrigued by going into the 2024 season. What games are on your viewing menu for this season? Non-Ohio State. That's the key. Can't be an Ohio State game. Games that you're most interested in watching, that you'll be glued to outside of when Ohio State is playing. I gave you my three. What do you got? We also talked about the running back room, College Football 25, and the Big Ten commercial being back in this segment. If you got any thoughts on those, hit me up at @SpenC2_. And of course, as always, in the 92 Through the Fan YouTube comment section. Comment sections can be dirty, grimy places at times, but generally you guys keep it pretty clean. You keep it pretty fun. And I do need to get better about responding to you guys. So I will work on that. We're all works in progress, right? That's always the line. We're always trying to work to get better and be better people and be better at our jobs. I need to get better at responding to you guys in the comments. So I'm going to try to do that this week. If you drop me a comment in the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel, I will get back to you. I am making that promise this week that I will get back to you. Please don't hold it against me if I break my promise. I'm really going to try not to, but if I do, don't hold it against me. That'll do it for another episode of Sons of the Shoe. Excited to be back next week with Nick as we'll talk to Alec Dietz, covers Oregon for the USA Today. We'll get his thoughts on the new massive expansion that is the Big Ten, Oregon's place in it, Oregon versus Ohio State if it's a budding rivalry, all those different things with him next week. So stay tuned for that. It should drop next Friday. In the meantime, we are 3 weeks out from the start of college football season, 4 weeks out. Let's see if I can get it on the camera here for those who are watching, not listening. 4 weeks out from Ohio State's first game of the season. Guys, it's right around the corner. I implore you to follow, subscribe, comment, whatever it is that you do to interact with your podcast. You can find us in the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, at the 92 Through the Fan YouTube channel, which is where I encourage you to comment as well, but also Apple Podcasts in case you forgot. We appreciate you guys as always. We'll be back with another episode of Sons of the Shoe next week. Until then, as always, go Bucks.